I set the table for 8 people who never planned to come. The good china was polished, the candles were lit, and the roast sat in the oven exactly the way my late husband used to like it, as if somehow honoring that detail would make this night feel whole again. I checked the clock. 6:05 p.m. Then 6:20. Then 7 o'clock. My phone stayed silent on the counter, the screen dark. No messages, no missed calls, no explanations. I told myself there must be traffic or a last-minute delay, something reasonable, something kind. By 7:30, I stopped pretending. The house felt too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I sat down at the head of the table and looked at the empty chairs, each one carefully placed for people who had slowly learned how to erase me without ever saying it out loud. I picked up my phone, not to call, just to see if maybe I had missed something. That was when I saw it. A photo at the top of my feed. My son, Daniel, standing on the deck of a cruise ship, his arm wrapped around Ashley, my daughter-in-law, both of them smiling into the sunset like something out of a magazine. Behind them, my grandchildren leaned against the railing, laughing. The caption read, "Family getaway." Much needed. I stared at the screen for a long time. Same day, same hour, same family, just not me. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't even breathe differently. I just sat there, watching the candles burn lower, the wax dripping slowly onto the polished wood, and something inside me shifted. Not broke. Shifted. Because suddenly, this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. It wasn't forgetfulness or poor timing or innocent mistakes. It was a pattern. Christmas dinners I was told were canceled, that somehow still happened. Birthdays I showed up to late because I'd been given the wrong time. School events I missed because no one thought to mention them. And every time, there was always a soft apology, always Ashley standing there with that polite smile, explaining it away so gently that I questioned my own memory. I used to think she was just busy, organized, particular. Now, sitting alone at my own birthday table, I realized something colder. She wasn't disorganized. She was precise. Every absence had been arranged. Every distance carefully measured. I looked back at the photo again, at the way she stood at the center of it all, exactly where I used to stand, and for the first time, I didn't feel confused. I felt clear. Because earlier that week, quite by accident, I had come across something I wasn't meant to see. A document. My name. A transfer. Quiet. Clean. Final. And as the last candle flickered in front of me, I understood that tonight wasn't the beginning of my loneliness. It was the moment I finally saw it for what it was. And more importantly, it was the moment I stopped being the only one in the dark. I did not clear the table right away. I left everything exactly as it was. The plates untouched, the glasses still full, the napkins folded neatly beside chairs no one had bothered to pull out. The candles had burned all the way down, leaving thin trails of hardened wax across the wood, and the roast in the oven had gone cold hours ago. I stood there for a long moment, just looking at it all, as if the scene itself might explain something I had missed. Then I turned off the oven, slowly, deliberately, the click echoing louder than it should have in an empty house. I moved through the kitchen the way I always had, rinsing dishes, wrapping leftovers, wiping down counters, each motion familiar, automatic, but tonight there was a distance between me and everything I was doing. It felt like I was watching someone else live my life, someone who had spent decades making sure everyone else felt comfortable, welcomed, included. Someone who never stopped to ask if she was being quietly removed from the picture she had built. I dried my hands and walked back into the dining room, my eyes falling again to my phone where that photo still lingered at the top of the screen. I opened it this time, studying the details more carefully. The location tag, the comments, the way Ashley had responded to each one with that same polished warmth she used in person, thanking people, laughing, presenting a version of our family that looked effortless and close. I noticed the date the trip had been booked, mentioned casually in a reply to one of her friends. Months ago, well before my birthday invitations had even been sent out. That detail settled into place quietly, like a final piece of something I had been trying not to see. This had never been a scheduling conflict. It had been a decision. I set the phone down and walked toward the living room, where the soft glow of a lamp still lit the corner by the bookshelf. That was where I had found the document earlier that week, tucked inside a folder that did not belong to me. I had not been looking for anything important. Just an old recipe I thought I had saved between the pages of a book. Instead, I found my name printed in clean, formal letters, attached to terms and conditions that were not written for my benefit. A transfer of ownership. A timeline. Language that suggested planning, not possibility. I had read it twice, then a third time, not because I did not understand it, but because I could not quite accept how quietly something so significant had been set in motion without a single conversation. I remember sitting down in that chair, the same one I was standing beside now, and realizing that while I had been focusing on keeping traditions alive, someone else had been quietly rewriting the future without me in it. Tonight confirmed what that paper had only hinted at. I walked over and sat down, placing my hands in my lap, feeling the steady rhythm of my own breathing. For years, I had filled silence with excuses for other people. They are busy. They did not mean it that way. It was probably just a misunderstanding. But silence, I was beginning to understand, could also be used as a tool. It could hide intention. It could smooth over patterns until they looked like coincidence. And I had allowed that for far too long. I looked around the room one more time, at the home I had built piece by piece, memory by memory, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was standing in the center of it. I felt like a guest who had stayed too long, politely waiting for an invitation that was never coming. That realization should have broken me. It did not. It steadied me. Because if this had all been carefully arranged, if every absence and every oversight had been part of something deliberate, then that meant one thing. It could be undone just as deliberately. And this time, I would not be the last to know. I woke up the next morning at exactly 6:15, the way I always had, even though there was no one to cook for and nowhere I needed to be. And for a moment, I lay still in bed, listening to the quiet settle into the walls of the house like it belonged there now, like it had been waiting for this version of my life to finally arrive. I did not reach for my phone right away. I already knew what I would see if I did. More photos, more smiles, more proof that somewhere out there, my family was enjoying something that had been carefully planned without me. Instead, I got up, made my coffee the same way I had for years, 2 teaspoons of sugar, a splash of cream, and carried the mug to the kitchen table where the morning light came through the window, just enough to make everything look softer than it really was. I sat down and let my eyes rest on the small details I used to overlook. The faint scratch on the table from when Daniel was 10 and insisted on carving his initials into something he thought he would always own. The corner cabinet where I used to keep snacks for the grandchildren, now mostly empty because their visits had become shorter, less frequent, easier to cancel. I used to believe that distance happened naturally, that children grew up, built their own lives, and that a little space was simply part of that process. But this was not distance. Distance does not require coordination. Distance does not need careful timing or quiet adjustments to schedules and information. What I had been living through was something else entirely, something that required intention. I took a slow sip of my coffee and finally reached for my phone, opening the same photo again, this time reading through the comments more closely. Friends praising Ashley for organizing such a beautiful trip. People calling her thoughtful, generous, devoted to family. I noticed how she responded to each compliment with humility, always redirecting the attention, always presenting herself as someone who simply wanted to bring everyone together. I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because it was precise. She had built an image that no one would question, a version of herself that made any doubt seem unreasonable. If I had spoken up before, if I had said something even a year ago, I would have sounded bitter, confused, maybe even ungrateful. That realization settled into me with a strange kind of calm. I was not just dealing with exclusion. I was dealing with someone who understood perception, who knew exactly how to shape it. I set the phone down again and walked to the living room, my steps slower this time, more deliberate, as if I were finally moving through a space I had not fully seen before. The folder was still where I had left it, tucked between 2 books, easy to miss unless you knew what you were looking for. I picked it up and opened it again, scanning the lines I had memorized without meaning to. Dates, signatures, clauses that shifted control from one name to another with a quiet efficiency that left no room for confusion. My name was there, but only as a formality, a necessary step in a process that had already been decided. I ran my fingers lightly over the paper, not out of sentiment, but to ground myself in what was real. This was not speculation. This was not imagination. This was documentation. I thought about Daniel then, about the boy who used to run through this house with scraped knees and loud laughter, who once told me I would always be his home no matter where he lived. I wondered when that promise had been replaced, when his silence had started to mean agreement instead of uncertainty. But I did not let myself stay in that thought for long. Because whatever role he had played in this, whatever choices he had made, the pattern I was seeing had a clear architect. And for the first time, I understood that waiting for someone to explain it to me would be the same as accepting it. I closed the folder carefully and placed it back exactly where it had been, aligning it with the edge of the shelf so nothing looked disturbed. Then I returned to the kitchen, finished the last of my coffee, and rinsed the cup in the sink. My movements were steady, unhurried, almost peaceful, because the confusion that had followed me for years was gone now, replaced by something far more useful. Clarity does not come with noise. It arrives quietly, settles in, and changes the way you see everything that comes after. And as I stood there, looking out at the morning that felt different without needing to explain why, I realized that for the first time in a very long while, I was no longer reacting to what was happening around me. I was beginning to understand how to respond. By mid-morning, the house looked exactly the way it always had, clean, orderly, untouched by anything that might suggest something had shifted beneath the surface. And that was the first detail that stayed with me. How easy it was for everything to appear normal when the truth had been quietly rearranged just out of sight. I moved through the hallway and paused at the framed photos lining the wall, each one capturing a version of our family that felt complete at the time. Birthdays, holidays, small moments that had seemed too ordinary to ever question. In every picture, I was there, somewhere near the center, holding a child, standing beside Daniel, smiling in a way that assumed I belonged exactly where I was. I studied those images more carefully now, not for what they showed, but for what they suggested. Ashley had not always been the focal point. There was a time when she stood slightly to the side, observing, learning, fitting herself into the space that already existed. I remember how thoughtful she seemed in those early years, how she would ask questions about traditions, about recipes, about the way things had always been done. I had taken that as respect. Now I understood it differently. It was not curiosity. It was preparation. She had learned the structure before she began to reshape it. I reached out and adjusted one of the frames slightly, straightening it even though it was not truly crooked, just enough to give my hands something to do while my thoughts settled into place. The pattern was clearer now, not because anything new had happened, but because I had stopped dismissing what had already been there. The missed invitations had not been accidents. The changes in schedule had not been misunderstandings. Even the small things, like being told a dinner was canceled only to later see photos of it happening without me, had all followed the same quiet logic. It was never direct, never confrontational, always wrapped in something that could be explained away if questioned. That was what made it effective. It left no obvious moment to push back against, no single event dramatic enough to confront without sounding unreasonable. It was a slow adjustment of position, one step at a time, until I was no longer standing where I thought I was. I walked into the living room again and sat down in the chair by the window, the same one where I had first read that document, and I let myself think about Ashley without the filter I had used for years. She was not careless. She was not overwhelmed. She was deliberate. She understood timing, perception, and most importantly, she understood patience. She had never tried to remove me all at once. That would have caused resistance. Instead, she had reduced my presence gradually, making each absence feel temporary until it became permanent. And Daniel had followed along, not necessarily out of cruelty, but out of convenience. It was easier to agree, easier to avoid discomfort, easier to accept the version of reality that required the least explanation. I did not need to prove that anymore. I could see it in the way he had stopped questioning things, the way his silence had aligned with her decisions without ever needing to be spoken out loud. I leaned back in the chair and closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape the thought, but to hold it steady without distraction. There is a difference between realizing something and accepting it, and I could feel that shift happening now, the quiet transition from understanding to decision. Because once you see a pattern clearly, you have two choices. You can continue to live inside it, adjusting yourself to fit the shape someone else has created, or you can step outside of it and allow the structure to reveal itself for what it is. I opened my eyes and looked at the room again, this time not as someone holding on to what had been, but as someone evaluating what remained. The house was still mine. The memories were still mine. The position I had lost had not been taken by force. It had been reassigned through silence. And silence, I was beginning to understand, could be broken just as carefully as it had been used. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my blouse, and walked toward the hallway with a steadiness I had not felt the day before. Because the difference now was simple. I was no longer trying to be included in something that had already decided to exclude me. I was beginning to decide what would happen next. I did not call anyone that day, and no one called me, which told me more than any conversation ever could, because silence, when it is shared, has a different weight than silence that is chosen alone, and this silence felt coordinated, like a pause that had been agreed upon without my knowledge. I moved through the afternoon slowly, not because I was unsure of what to do, but because I was allowing myself to notice things I had ignored for years. The mail arrived just after 1 o'clock, the same time it always did, and I walked to the front door, opened it, and picked up the small stack of envelopes waiting on the porch. Bills, advertisements, nothing out of the ordinary, until I saw a familiar name printed neatly in the corner of one envelope, a legal office I had not heard from in quite some time. I stood there for a moment before opening it, not out of fear, but out of recognition, as if some part of me had already been expecting this confirmation. Inside was a formal notice, brief and precise, referencing a review of property arrangements and requesting my presence for a discussion regarding future planning. The language was polite, professional, and carefully neutral, but I could read what was not written between the lines. This was not a courtesy. This was a step in a process that had already begun. I folded the letter slowly and placed it on the table, aligning it with the edge in the same careful way I had done with the document earlier, noticing how steady my hands remained. There was a time when something like this would have sent me searching for reassurance, reaching for Daniel, asking questions, hoping for an explanation that would make everything feel less deliberate. But that instinct had faded, replaced by something quieter and far more useful. I did not need reassurance anymore. I needed clarity, and clarity had already started to reveal itself in ways that could not be ignored. I walked into the study, a room that had once belonged to my husband, and sat down at the desk where he used to keep his papers organized in a way only he fully understood. After he passed, I had preserved it exactly as it was, as if keeping his system intact would somehow keep his presence close. Now, for the first time, I opened the drawers with a different intention, not to remember, but to understand. Files were stacked neatly, labeled in his handwriting, each one containing pieces of our life that had been built carefully over decades. Mortgage records, insurance policies, investment summaries, all the quiet structures that supported everything we had created together. I moved through them methodically, not rushing, not reacting, simply observing what was there and what was missing. It did not take long to notice the gaps, small at first, a document that should have been filed but was not, a record that had been referenced but no longer present. Each absence was subtle, easy to overlook if you were not paying attention, but together they formed a pattern that felt familiar now. I closed the drawer and sat back, letting the pieces settle into place in my mind. This had not happened overnight. It had been happening alongside everything else, quietly, patiently, just out of reach until I was ready to see it. I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the yard, the same yard where Daniel used to play, where I had once believed that everything we built here would remain exactly where we left it. But things do not remain unchanged simply because we expect them to. They change when someone decides they should. And standing there, with the afternoon light stretching across the grass in long, quiet lines, I realized something that felt both simple and undeniable. If they had taken the time to plan this so carefully, if they had invested so much effort into shifting everything without confrontation, then they had also revealed something important without meaning to. They believed I would not notice. They believed I would not understand. And most of all, they believed I would not respond. I turned away from the window then, not with anger, not with urgency, but with a steady awareness that had replaced every uncertainty I had carried before. Because now, for the first time, I was no longer looking at what had been done to me as something I needed to endure. I was beginning to see it as something I could answer in my own way, on my own terms, and in my own time. The next morning arrived with a kind of stillness that no longer felt empty but intentional, as if the quiet itself had become something I could use rather than something I had to endure. And for the first time in a very long while, I did not feel the urge to fill it with distractions or explanations that no one had asked for. I followed my usual routine again, but this time every movement had a purpose beyond habit. Every small action a way of grounding myself in a reality that I was finally beginning to understand clearly. After breakfast, I sat down at the desk in the study and pulled out a notepad, not because I needed to write anything down, but because I wanted to see the thoughts in my mind take shape in a way that could not be ignored or softened. I began listing what I knew, not what I felt, not what I suspected, but what I could confirm. The trip had been planned months in advance. I had not been invited. Documents regarding property had been moved or altered. A legal office was now contacting me directly about future arrangements. Each point was simple, factual, undeniable. And when I looked at them together, the pattern was no longer subtle. It was structured. I set the pen down and leaned back slightly, letting the clarity settle without rushing to the next step. Because reacting too quickly would only serve the version of events they expected from me. Confusion, emotion, questions. I had played that role before without realizing it, and it had given them exactly what they needed: time, space, and silence. That was not what I would offer now. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed softly on the desk, the sound cutting through the quiet with a familiarity that made me glance at it immediately. Daniel's name appeared on the screen. I watched it for a moment before answering, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. This call was not accidental. It was timed. I picked up on the third ring. His voice came through warm, casual, almost too carefully relaxed. He asked how I was doing, mentioned the trip briefly as if it were something spontaneous, something that had simply come together at the last minute. I listened without interrupting, letting him speak, letting him fill the silence the way he always had when something felt slightly off, but not enough to confront directly. When he paused, waiting for my response, I kept my tone steady. I told him I was fine. I told him the house was quiet. I told him I hoped they were enjoying themselves. There was a small shift on the other end of the line, subtle but noticeable, as if he had expected something else, a question, a complaint, some indication that I had been affected. When it did not come, he adjusted quickly, moved the conversation forward, asked about small things that did not matter. We spoke for a few more minutes. Nothing significant, nothing revealing. And then the call ended the same way it had begun, politely, without friction, without resolution. I set the phone back down and sat there for a moment, replaying the conversation not for what was said, but for what was avoided. He had not asked about the dinner. He had not acknowledged the date. He had not mentioned that they had all been together while I was alone. That omission was not accidental. It was part of the same pattern, the same careful control of information that allowed everything to continue without disruption. I stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the yard that now felt less like a place of memory and more like a space I could still define for myself. The difference was subtle, but it was there. I was no longer waiting for someone to include me in their version of the story. I was beginning to understand how to step outside of it entirely. And as that thought settled in, clear and steady, I realized that the next move did not need to be loud or immediate. It only needed to be precise. The rest of the day unfolded quietly, but beneath that quiet there was a new kind of movement, something deliberate that did not require urgency to be effective, and I found myself paying attention not just to what was happening around me, but to how I was responding to it, measuring each reaction carefully instead of letting it form out of habit. By late afternoon, I returned to the study and sat at the desk again, this time not to search for more information, but to decide what to do with what I already had. I pulled the notepad closer and looked at the list I had written earlier, the facts arranged in a way that no longer felt overwhelming but structured, almost predictable. There was comfort in that, not because it made the situation better, but because it removed uncertainty, and uncertainty had been the only thing keeping me passive for so long. I picked up the pen and added a new line, not a fact, but a step. Confirm everything independently. It was a simple instruction, but it shifted something important in my thinking. I was no longer relying on what I had been told or what had been left unsaid. I would verify it myself. I reached for the letter from the legal office and read it again, this time focusing on the contact information at the bottom. A direct number. A name. I did not call immediately. That would have been the old version of me, reacting the moment something demanded attention. Instead, I placed the letter back on the desk and let the decision settle. Timing mattered. Not for them, but for me. I wanted every step I took to come from clarity, not urgency. As the sun began to lower, casting longer shadows across the floor, I stood up and walked through the house once more, this time with a different awareness. I noticed the small changes that had been introduced over time. Items moved, spaces adjusted, subtle shifts that had seemed insignificant before but now felt like part of a larger design. A drawer in the kitchen that no longer held what it used to. A cabinet where documents had been relocated. None of it was dramatic, none of it obvious, but together it told a consistent story. Control had been changing hands quietly, without confrontation, without announcement. I paused in the hallway again, looking at the photographs, but this time I did not study them for what they represented. I looked at them as evidence of a timeline, a record of when things began to change and how gradually it had been done. There was a precision to it that I could not ignore anymore. Ashley had not rushed. She had allowed each step to settle before moving to the next, ensuring that nothing felt abrupt enough to question. That level of patience required intention, and intention required awareness. She knew exactly what she was doing. The realization did not upset me the way it might have before. It steadied me further. Because if this had all been built on careful planning, then it could be met with the same level of care. I returned to the living room and sat down, folding my hands loosely in my lap, letting the quiet settle again. But this time it felt different. It no longer pressed against me. It supported me. For years, I had filled silence with explanations that protected other people from being questioned. Now I was allowing it to do something else entirely. I was allowing it to create space. Space to think. Space to observe. Space to act without being seen too soon. As evening approached, I picked up the phone again, not to call Daniel, not to reach out to anyone in the family, but to scroll back through the messages I had received over the past few months. Short replies, rescheduled plans, small apologies that never quite addressed the real issue. I read them without emotion, not because they did not matter, but because I could finally see them clearly for what they were. They were not isolated moments. They were part of a pattern that had been consistent all along. I set the phone down and leaned back slightly, my mind no longer searching for answers, but organizing what it already knew. The next step was no longer uncertain. It was simply a matter of when. And as I sat there, in a house that felt both familiar and entirely new at the same time, I understood something with a certainty I had not felt before. I did not need to confront them to change what was happening. I only needed to move carefully enough that they would not realize it had already changed. The following morning, I made the call, not with hesitation, not with urgency, but with the same steady awareness that had guided every step since that night. And when the receptionist answered, her voice polite and practiced, I introduced myself without adding anything unnecessary, simply stating my name and the reason for my call as it had been written in the letter, and within moments, I was transferred to the attorney whose name I had already memorized. His tone shifted the moment he recognized who I was, a slight pause, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm that my call was expected, or at the very least, anticipated. He spoke carefully, professionally, explaining that there had been recent inquiries regarding estate structuring and future asset alignment, phrases that sounded neutral on the surface but carried a weight that did not belong to casual conversation. I listened without interrupting, letting him finish, letting the explanation settle into place without reacting to the parts that were meant to soften the reality behind them. When he asked if I had been informed of these discussions previously, I answered truthfully, no. There was another pause then, longer this time, followed by a shift in tone that was no longer just professional, but cautious. He began to clarify details, mentioning that certain documents had been prepared but not finalized, that some steps required my direct authorization, that nothing had been fully executed without my consent. That was the detail that mattered. Not completed, not finalized, not beyond my reach. I thanked him for the information, asked for copies of everything that had been drafted, and provided an email address where they could be sent directly to me, not through anyone else, not filtered or delayed. He agreed without hesitation, perhaps relieved that I was not asking questions he could not answer, perhaps unaware that the questions I needed had already been resolved before. The call even began. When I ended the conversation, I did not sit down immediately. I stood there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, letting the confirmation settle fully into place. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a miscommunication. This was a plan that had moved forward under the assumption that I would not look closely enough to see it. I placed the phone down gently and walked to the window, the same place where I had stood the day before, but this time the view felt different, not because anything outside had changed, but because I had. The next steps became clear in a way that did not require urgency or emotion. I would not confront them. I would not accuse or explain. That would only bring everything into the open too soon, forcing reactions instead of revealing intentions. Instead, I would allow things to continue exactly as they had been, at least on the surface. I would answer calls the same way. I would respond to messages with the same calm tone. I would remain exactly who they believed me to be. But underneath that surface, the direction had already shifted. By the time the documents arrived in my inbox later that afternoon, I was ready to read them without distraction. I sat at the desk, opened each file, and moved through them slowly, not rushing, not reacting, simply absorbing the structure that had been built around me without my knowledge. Transfer clauses, contingencies, provisions that would have quietly repositioned ownership and control if left unchallenged. It was thorough, careful, designed to appear reasonable if viewed in isolation, but unmistakable when seen as a whole. I closed the final document and leaned back slightly, my hands resting loosely on the desk, feeling neither shock nor anger, only a quiet certainty that had replaced both. They had taken their time constructing this. They had relied on patience, on silence, on the assumption that I would not question what I was not shown. And now, standing on the other side of that assumption, I understood exactly how much time I had been given in return. Enough to see, enough to decide, enough to act without being seen too soon. I stood up, gathered the papers neatly, and placed them back into a folder, aligning the edges carefully, the same way everything else in this house had always been arranged. Because the order of things mattered. Not just what was done, but how it was done. And as I placed the folder back on the shelf, exactly where it would not be noticed, I understood something with complete clarity. They believed the plan was already in motion. They believed the outcome was only a matter of time. What they did not realize was that time, now, was no longer working in their favor. They returned 3 days later, just as I expected they would, not with hesitation, not with any visible awareness of what had shifted, but with the same polished normalcy that had defined everything they did. And I was already in the kitchen when I heard the front door open, voices filling the space as if nothing had been missing, as if nothing had been arranged without me. Daniel called out first, his tone light, casual, asking if I was home as though there had ever been a question. I answered from the kitchen, my voice steady, the same as it had always been, and I heard the slight relief in his response, the unspoken confirmation that everything was exactly where he expected it to be. Ashley followed closely behind him, her voice warm, measured, carrying that same practiced ease I had come to recognize. And when she stepped into the kitchen, she smiled the way she always did, as if the last few days had been nothing more than a pleasant interruption, something that required no explanation. She mentioned the trip briefly, describing it in general terms, avoiding specifics, offering just enough detail to acknowledge it without opening the door to questions. I listened, nodding once, not because I needed the information, but because the moment required it. There was no tension in my posture, no indication that anything had changed, and that was exactly what I intended. Because what mattered now was not what they believed had happened, but what they believed had not. We moved through the next few minutes in a rhythm that would have felt familiar to anyone watching from the outside. Coats were set aside. Bags were placed on the counter. The grandchildren's laughter echoed briefly from the hallway before they disappeared into another room. Everything appeared intact. But beneath that surface, the structure had already shifted in ways they could not yet see. I turned to the counter and reached for the folder I had prepared earlier that morning, its contents arranged carefully, not dramatically, not with any intention of confrontation, but with precision. I placed it on the table between us, not pushing it forward, not drawing attention to it, simply allowing it to exist within the space. Ashley's eyes moved to it almost immediately, a small flicker of curiosity crossing her expression before she looked back at me, waiting, assessing, the way she always did when something did not fit the pattern she had established. I met her gaze calmly and spoke without raising my voice, without altering my tone. I told them that I had spoken with the attorney. I told them that I had reviewed the documents. I told them that nothing had been finalized. There was a brief pause then, the kind that reveals more than any reaction, and I saw it in the way Daniel shifted slightly, in the way Ashley's expression adjusted just enough to signal that something had not gone according to plan. I did not continue immediately. I allowed the silence to settle, to expand, to do what it had always done, reveal what people were not prepared to say. Then I added one more detail, just enough to complete the picture. I told them that I would be making my own arrangements moving forward, that all decisions regarding the property and any related matters would be handled directly, without assumption, without delegation. My words were simple, but their meaning was not. There was no accusation in them, no need to explain what had been done or why. The evidence had already spoken. The structure had already been seen. What remained was only the outcome. Ashley was the first to respond, her voice still controlled, still measured, offering an explanation that came too quickly to be spontaneous, something about future planning, about wanting to help, about misunderstandings that could easily be clarified. I listened without interruption, the same way I had listened before, but this time there was no need to interpret, no need to question. When she finished, I did not argue. I did not correct her. I simply nodded once and closed the folder, placing my hand over it briefly as if to confirm its presence, not for them, but for myself. Because the difference now was not in what they said. It was in what I knew. And as I looked at them, standing in a house that had once felt entirely shared, I understood something with complete certainty. They had spent months, perhaps longer, believing they were quietly moving pieces into place, believing that each small step would go unnoticed until it was too late to change. What they had not considered was that recognition does not need to be loud to be final. It only needs to be clear. And in that moment, standing across from them with nothing raised but the truth itself, I knew that whatever they had planned was no longer the path that would be followed. Because the moment I saw it, truly saw it, was the moment it stopped belonging to them.